So we're about halfway through the course right now, and we're finally, I guess, going to start talking about the Canadian Constitution. And the Canadian constitutional documents are a little bit different than what most people sort of expect when we talk about constitutions, because constitutions for most of the sort of New World countries, such as they are sort of associated with the early part of a country's history. So when we talk about, for example, the US Constitution, we're talking about the Declaration of Independence, you're talking about stuff that goes back to sort of the beginnings of the country. And Canada's Constitution, at least as far as it goes, really dates back sort of in its current form to 1982, which is not that long ago. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that came to be, but I just want to correct a couple of misconceptions. There's a couple of people who sort of talk about the Constitution of Canada being only accessible to Canada in 1982, and that's not actually correct. We're going to sort of talk about what leads up to sort of the experiences of what we refer to as the repatriation of the Constitution in Canadian history today, and that's sort of what we're going to get into. But it actually is possible to sort of, for Canada to take control of its own constitution, right? That's sort of another piece that's important, is that before 1982, it's not that Canada didn't have a constitution or didn't have laws governing its existence. It's that those laws and those negotiations are housed in the sort of British parliamentary system rather than on Canadian soil, such as it is. And there's a number of like really important decisions that actually happen that way. So if you've heard talk about the famous five or the Persons case, which is the sort of legal challenge that declared women to be people under the law and therefore eligible to hold seats in the Canadian Senate and that kind of thing, that's a legal case that's not actually decided in Canada at all. The top Canadian court at the time said women aren't people, and the famous five, so women from Alberta, you probably have heard their names, Louise McKinney, Nellie McClung, Henrietta Muir Edwards. You spend a lot of time in the parks around here, Agnes MacPhail. You'll see a lot of parks named after them. There's sort of that kind of commemoration, because they're mostly based in Alberta, so there's that kind of piece. But that case is decided in the British Privy Council, and that's sort of a function of this sort of late process of Canada taking control of its constitution, along with it sort of the Canadian Supreme Court, that kind of thing. So this whole process of possibility in terms of Canada's ability to do two things simultaneously. On the one hand, to be able to control its own constitution and be the highest law in its own land, and on the other hand, remain part of the British Commonwealth. Right? That's what Canada is trying to do. And it becomes possible for countries to do that, countries in the British Empire anyway, to do that after the Statute of Westminster is passed in 1931. And this is a law that is passed after the end of World War I. And it is, in a lot of ways, a recognition on the part of the British Crown that many of its colonies were functioning and were acting, specifically during the war, as legitimate countries and legitimate powers in their own right. So if you've ever sort of heard discussions about battles in World War I am going to get them wrong because I'm not a particularly accurate war historian, but the Somme, that kind of thing, if you're talking about that sort of thing, then Canada is sort of often described as coming into its own in that sort of trench warfare in World War I and sort of existing and exerting itself as a power in its own right. The Statute of Westminster is a recognition of that. And what it kind of does is it allows colonies, in this case Canada, but it also affects Australia, New Zealand, that kind of thing, to take control of their own constitutions and to sort of enter the international community as countries in their own right, rather than as sort of like London's tag-along little brother. Okay, so there's that sort of piece to it. You can also see it as a recognition on the part of London that, especially after World War I, which is an expensive sort of endeavor, they can't really afford an empire anymore, so they wanted to sort of be able to have their former colonies functioning more independently, essentially to save them money. It's sort of a theme. Now, other countries repatriate their constitutions shortly thereafter. So, for example, Australia repatriates their constitution in the 1930s, shortly after the Statute of Westminster. Canada decides not to do that. And one of the reasons for that is that Canada's population and demographic sort of existence is much more complicated than Australia's, for example. Because if you have your own, if you're controlling your own constitution, then you need to have in hand rules available for how do you amend it if you have to. So how do you change this law if you need to do so? And in Canada, that becomes a really interesting question, right? Because who needs to consent in order to change the Constitution if we're going to change it? Do the provinces? Okay, but do all provinces need to do that? Only some of them? Do certain provinces need to be included in the people who say yes? Do other people don't? And if you've sort of been following our discussions about linguistic politics, you'll see a lot of sort of, hey, there's some disagreements about what's going on there. Does Ottawa need to consent to do that? And what does that look like? Does 50% plus one count as Ottawa agreeing to a constitutional change? Do you need to pass it through both houses? Do you, like, what majority do you need? Can the Senate overrule the House of Commons passing? Can the House of Commons overrule the Senate's decision? Do you need to take it back to the population? Do you need to ask those sorts of questions? And practically speaking, in the 1930s, Canada just didn't want to deal with those questions. So they kind of like left that on a shelf and just didn't touch it. They're like, yeah, that's possible, but we're not going to do that. And so they sort of left that sort of experience of repatriation as like, yeah, we might get to that a little bit later. Things have changed in Canada by 1982, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about how that change comes about. So this is one of the reasons why our last unit is sort of really weird, and it sort of goes from Confederation all the way through the FLQ crisis in 1970, because one of the things that has changed in Canada by sort of the early 1980s is that experience of tensions in Quebec and troubles in Quebec. And we've got a couple examples of them. We've already talked about the FLQ crisis and sort of separatist violence and that kind of conversation and like the rising separatist sentiment. That takes on sort of a new character in 1980 when there's the first referendum for Quebec to separate from Canada. We'll talk a little bit more in detail in that sort of space about that referendum a little bit later on. What you need to know for right now is that it fails, right? Quebec does not vote to separate from Canada in 1980. 59.5% or so of Quebec's population vote to stay in Canada. And this is the place where we have to hit some of the other, like one of the other really, really, really big factors in the conversation around constitutional repatriation. And that's not a pattern or a trend, that's a person. So you have probably, I don't remember if I said it earlier in my lectures, but one of my favorite quotes about Pierre Trudeau, so Justin Trudeau's father, is a journalist who said that in Pierre Trudeau, Canada has finally produced a leader worth assassinating. Whatever else, of whatever political space you want to sort of talk about Trudeau from, it is important to recognize at least a couple of things about him. First of all, he's a very intelligent man. So he was an intellectual, a writer, that kind of thing, before he went into politics. And second, he's an incredibly charismatic man. So he, like, this is a very similar experience. Like, if he went to speak, you'd have crowds of screaming young women. They referred to it as Trudeau mania. He was really, really, really popular in a way that few politicians ever are. And Pierre Trudeau was that. And so that combination of intelligence and charisma, right? And that allows Trudeau to get rid of to do a lot of things that would just be unthinkable for other politicians to do. You'll see the sort of videos of him pirouetting behind the Queen when they're walking. Like, there's all that kind of stuff that, like, Trudeau can do, and it makes him sort of a really engaging public figure, okay? And that's important because it's an aspect of our political life that we don't often talk about, which is that in a lot of ways, politicians can do different things if they can convince people to care about them. And convincing people to care about them is kind of akin to marketing and charisma and that kind of stuff. So politicians that achieve a certain degree of celebrity in some ways can do things that other politicians cannot do because the population won't put up with it. So by the 1980s, you have a couple of things happening at the same time. One, you have a really charismatic prime minister sitting in 24 Sussex. So Pierre Trudeau is prime minister by now, and he is an incredibly charismatic man. I won't say always that he's very popular. Right? Most of my students grew up in Alberta. They're well aware that there are a lot of people around them who really don't like Trudeau. But that ability to provoke a strong dislike is also, in a lot of ways, a marker of charisma. Right? People who are not charismatic are just boring and no one cares. Trudeau provokes a strong reaction regardless of where you go. So there's that kind of piece. You have a really charismatic prime minister. You have evidence of strong tensions in Quebec that are making life difficult and sort of are presenting English Canada with an idea that this is potentially reaching a breaking point, in that you have terrorist violence, so in the October 1970 crisis, and then you have fundamental attempts to change the nature of the country, because you have a vote to separate, like you have an attempt at sort of a referendum to separate from Canada in 1980. This is becoming very, very real. And at the same time, sort of globally, you have this trend towards decolonization, and you have this trend in the world around sort of understanding that it's probably inappropriate for one country to be wholly administered by another. There's sort of this idea about autonomy. This is a broader decolonization movement. It's largely anchored in sort of what we would refer to as developing or formerly colonial nations. So this is a big conversation about the independence of states in Africa, independence of states in parts of Asia and Southeast Asia. All of that kind of conversation is really, really prevalent in the world in the 1980s, and that's an important part of that, because Canada doesn't really want to be classed in that same sort of like, oh, backwater colonial nations kind of thing. There's sort of an impetus broadly to talk about that kind of independence and that kind of idea. So those are a couple of factors that have shifted between 1931 to 1982 that sort of lead to repatriation. And now we're actually going to talk about what happens in 1982.